Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Fertility Network UK webinar. I'm Kate from Fertility Network UK, and this evening we're going to be talking about adoption after fertility problems. And we're joined by Alison Woodhead, and Alison is the Director of Public Affairs and Communications for Adoptant UK, and she is also an adopter herself. And we've got with us too Fertility Network UK's own Anya Sizer. And Anya's with us this evening because she has personal experience of adopting after having fertility problems. Anya has two IVF children and an adopted child. We are recording this webinar. It's going to be on our website probably from sometime next week, and you can find it on the webinars page on the website. You can also ask questions this evening. You need to put them in the chat box, and in order to do that, what we suggest you do so that they remain anonymous to everyone else is just address them to the hosts and not to everyone else, which you can do to hosts and panelists. So don't worry though if you do it the other way around and let everyone see it, because we're not going to be reading out anyone's names. Any questions you ask will be completely anonymous, so don't worry about that. Before we start this evening, I just had a very quick plea from the charity. As you probably know, everything we offer is completely free, from our support line, which is open every weekday, our fertility groups across the country, our information line, and all the webinars that we run like this one. But we can only offer all this thanks to your generosity. So if you do feel able to make a small donation, we'd be hugely grateful. And you can do that very easily now by texting. You just text the letters FNUK and the amount you want to donate to 70085. So if you'd like to donate £5, that's FNUK 5 to 70085. Or for £10, that's FNUK 10 to 70085. So thank you very much in advance to anyone who does feel able to help us in this way. We really do rely on your support, so thank you. But for now, let's get on with the webinar this evening. Alison, I wanted to start with you, and I wondered if you could kind of explain a bit about how adoption works in the UK, just the basics, really.
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much for having me, and it's lovely to be here this evening. There are basically two routes to adoption. So people can either apply through essentially their local authority, or they can apply to a voluntary adoption agency, which is essentially an independent version of the adoption agency. And they can there are lots of places for them to find out how to apply. So our own website, Adoption UK's website, can help you with that. And you basically search for the adoption agencies in your area. And then the first thing that happens is you need to make a phone call, and you just, as you would with any other thing in your life, phone up, express an interest. And then that begins the process. And I think one thing that's important to say is that if at any point you decide that it's not for you, you can back out. I mean, I remember myself at the moment at which I got the news that my child was going to be placed with me, asking my social worker, do I still have to go through with it, because I was so terrified and overwhelmed by the whole thing. So really, until then, the answer was no, you don't. So a step forward isn't irrevocable, I suppose, is the moral of that story. And then there's a process. Once you're in the system and you've decided to go ahead, there's a process. There's basically a 4-stage process, regardless of which agency you go with. So the first stage is initial checks, so background checks, that kind of thing. The second stage is assessment and training. So you will be allocated a social worker who then will come to your home, or during pandemic, it was all virtual, of course, and work through a very tried and tested series of questions and challenges with you. And you will also go on what's called a preparation course with a number of other adopters who are going through the process at the same time as you. Then stage 3. So then, if you decide to stick with it, then you will go to what's called an adoption panel, where you'll be assessed by a number of people who will all sit in a room with you, and you will find out very quickly whether you've been approved to adopt or not. And if you're approved to adopt, then it moves into stage 4, which is, stage 3, which is the matching process. And that's where you and your social worker will start actively looking for the right child for your family. And then the final stage is placement, basically, so that child moving in with you and coming to live with you as your forever child. The whole of that process can take anything between 9 months and several years. So I think with a good smooth process would take about 9 months. My own process took about 4 years, so that's unusual, but it's possible. So I think it's good to be open-eyed about that, really. So that's the way it works. It doesn't cost the adopter anything. It's completely free. The only exception to that is if you apply to adopt from overseas, which is costly and is a whole different process. Yeah, I think those are the basics, really. There are about 3,000 adoptions every year. So we reckon there are probably at least 55,000 adoptive families across the UK. And I'm happy to tell you more about the kind of kids that are waiting and all that sort of stuff if you're interested. So feel free to ask questions.
The thing I wanted to ask you next was, how common is it for people to adopt after fertility problems, and how straightforward is that process? I mean, is it quite a common thing for people to do?
So about half of the people who come forward for adoption or express an interest in adoption have come forward because of they've had fertility problems. Actually, that's a slightly decreasing, a sort of very slowly decreasing number. I think there are a number of reasons for that. Partly it's because fertility treatment obviously is improving all the time. It's partly because people adopting as a first choice to make a family is on the rise, and that's for all sorts of reasons. I think, people concerned with the environment and planetary boundaries is one reason for that. There are people have religious and cultural beliefs which move them straight into adoption as opposed to having birth children. So there are all sorts of reasons, but at the moment it's about half of people who come forward for adoption come through infertility. In terms of whether it's an easy process or not, I mean, I'd sort of defer to Anya on that one, but anecdotally, I think the thing that social workers want to know is that you've processed what's happened to you, and obviously there isn't a sort of beginning and end point of that. It's like all processes, it's an ongoing thing, but they will need to feel confident that you are not carrying a huge burden of grief forward and loss forward with you. Having said that, some of that grief and loss is actually quite helpful in understanding what the children who are waiting for adoption have been through. So I think it's quite an interesting story, actually. But I think Anya's better placed to answer the question about how easy or otherwise it is.
Yeah, I was going to come to you, Anya, now to really ask you what you thought people needed to do to prepare for that kind of movement to thinking about treatment or having unsuccessful treatment to actually starting to think about adoption. I mean, what would you advise? What was your process like?
We found the process actually okay. I think we'd found fertility treatment so grueling, so distressing, with so many unknowns, that actually adoption, the process for us, felt okay. It felt like, there was lots of social work meetings, similar to you, Alison. Ours went on forever. I think it took us about 3 years, 3.5 years, start to finish. There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of things to think about. But compared to the uncertainty that you hold when going through treatment, we as a couple found it easier. And possibly some of that was because we had children from IVF. So, I'm not negating that at all. We have found the two processes quite different in a way. But we have found post-adoption to be the more difficult of the places. Now, I say that as someone that will always support and encourage adoption. It's an incredible thing to do. We don't regret it for a minute, but it has also been the toughest thing that we've ever done, and that includes for us IVF and numerous IVFs. To go back to how you can prepare, I think you do need that gap. So nearly always, I think always, when you go from treatment to adoption, there's a period of time that's recommended, 6 months to a year, I think most adoption agencies, where there's a chance to process some of what's happened and then move on to what's about to happen. And I think that stage is really, really important. And it's why I'm very, very grateful to be a member of FN UK, but also very involved with Adoption UK and very passionate about Adoption UK, because that bridge is absolutely vital. It's really vital that we support people when going from something very intense to another really quite intense process, and give them the preparation and support they need. I think one of the key things in thinking about the two journeys of parenthood and everything is really, with adoption, keeping that focus that this is actually at the heart about the child. Adoption in its heart is about finding a family for children that desperately need a family. And so it's really keeping that focus and that perspective. The children almost inevitably will come with a story. Even if they're from birth, there's still a story of why they're there for adoption. And so it's being robust enough, resilient enough, and open enough to incorporate that whole story and take it on. And it is a very different journey. Being an adoptive parent for me has been quite a different experience to being a parent to my birth children. Not in terms of one is better than the other at all, but in terms of there are layers and complexities with adoption that there haven't been with my birth children. And I think as you go from one stage, fertility treatment not working, into adoption, it's really important that all of that is supported and resourced and unpacked. And that's where Adoption UK comes in. And that's where hopefully Fertility Network, we're going to be doing more work around that as well. But they're very different, equal value, but very different.
We've had a question which kind of slightly follows on from that. Someone's asked, and I think maybe this is one for you to kind of, Anya, you've answered some of this, but I think Alison, maybe if you could just spell this out a bit. Someone's asking why it's not possible to go through the adoption process at the same time as you're doing IVF. You're on mute at the moment.
I think for the reasons that Anya's just really, really well described, that I think your brain would explode probably if you were trying to do both things at the same time. So when you're being assessed and trained pre-adoption, you learn all about the backgrounds of the children who end up needing to be placed for adoption, and those and that is mind-blowing. I mean, it really is. Even if you think you know what poverty, inequality, desperation looks like in this country, prepare to have your mind blown, because it is really very distressing and it's very intense. So you will be asked by your social worker lots of questions, necessarily so, that are quite very personal, that kind of dig into your emotional resilience, and your personal family story and what has led you to adoption. And if you were trying to do that while at the same time coping with the emotion of going through infertility treatment, I think that would be too much for a human being to take, really.
You explained that very clearly. Thank you, Alison. Anya, is there anything you would say that people actually can do to prepare themselves for this?
Yeah, I think you do need that breathing space. If you've been through a process of treatment not working, you need self-care in a massive way. So you need to really, really take those 6 months to a year and massively rebuild yourself. Make sure that you are helped in any way possible. Where possible, finding a way to acknowledge the grief of treatment not working and the sadness around that, whatever that might mean. Some people choose to do some kind of a ceremony or plant a tree. We planted rose bushes every time we had treatment that didn't work. Something that acknowledges that stage of your life that you've been through, and then to take that time proactively and use it. It can, for people who've been through treatment, everything's about waiting. Everything's about, oh my goodness, the next doctor's appointment is in 4 months' time. Everything is on hold. So to have an adoption agency turn around to you and go, actually, we're asking you now for another 6 months to a year, can feel so frustrating. But my encouragement would be to say, use that proactively. So who are the potential adopters that you can maybe talk to? What are the webinars? Adoption UK do fantastic webinars on prospective adopters. What are the books that you could read? My favorite, I'll just name check, Sally Donovan's books. I love Sally Donovan's books. There's other great ones out there, but she's super honest and real and accessible. Grab hold of some of hers. Start to research, as Alison's just said, the reality of adoption. It's messy and it's painful at times, and it's a mirror to society that maybe we don't want to see, but we need to get attuned to it if we really are going to go down that path. And then more than anything, I think for me would be building that network around you that are going to be your tribe that will see you through. And that's the bit that actually, in hindsight, I think I tick boxed a little bit because I was so desperate to get on with it. Yeah, we've got an amazing network of people that will be there for us at 3 a.m, whatever. I was so desperate to keep moving on that actually what I wish I'd done is really pause and think, actually, have I helped those people to know what adoption is? Have I told them how to help me, asked them how to help me? Have I really got a strong team around me that when the poo hits the fan, as it almost inevitably will at some point with adoption, who's going to be there for me? And just to make sure those people are in place, I think that is absolutely key. So it's a process, and it's not a wilderness time. I think very often we see that 6 months as a bit of a, we just want to move on. Actually really build that time, build yourself up, build your team up, and get the knowledge that you need to move forward. And then you'll be so much better equipped to going into the adoption process.
We've got quite a few questions coming in, and we've got someone, this one is for you, Alison, someone asking, are there many children from Southeast Asian backgrounds? I mean, what is the situation with ethnic minority children in adoption?
There are children from Southeast Asian backgrounds, and obviously, as you could imagine, it's very geographically specific. So in certain parts of London, for example, you get more Southeast Asian children, other parts of the country as well. So generally speaking, children who are from Black or ethnic minority backgrounds are the children who are likely to wait longest for adoption. And the reason for that is that there is a scarcity of adopters who are from some connected ethnic similar background. So that this is an interesting area, because most social workers would tell you they're not looking for a perfect ethnic match, and it isn't necessarily, obviously no child should wait longer in care because of the color of their skin. So, we would rather find a family from a child than wait for a perfect ethnic match for that child. But there are also, obviously, it goes without saying, enormous benefits for having cultural and ethnic matches for children who have already suffered lots of change and loss. Sorry, that was a bit of a kind of ramble, but so there's a group that Black and ethnic minority children are most in need of adoptive parents, and then there are several other groups who also wait longer. So children with disabilities, children in sibling groups, and children who are a little bit older, so the age of 5 and above. So those children always wait a lot longer, sometimes 2x, 3 times as long as other children in the system. So at the moment, actually, there are more prospective adopters, than there are children waiting to be adopted. So we've kind of, in the 4 years I've worked for Adoption UK, the situation is completely reversed. And what that means is the more open-minded you can be about the kind of child you could welcome into your family, the better, because you're more likely to be quickly matched that way. So it's also important to bear in mind, I think, for people, that the average age for a child to be adopted in the UK is 3.5. So I think that's the other thing that is potentially very difficult for people who are coming to adoption from fertility problems. Not only are you transitioning from having birth children to adopting, you're also transitioning from having a baby to, in all likelihood, bringing home a much older child. And that's another good reason for giving yourself some breathing space between the two processes. So yeah.
Having just spoken about ages of children, are there age limits for potential parents, or are there any other limits on potential parents?
The only limits, and this is all theoretical, of course, because it comes down to your agency, but the only limits are that you have to be at least 21, no criminal convictions for anything related to sexual abuse or predatory behaviour towards any danger towards children. And there's one other. What is it? I can't remember what you have to have been resident in the UK for at least, I think it's 2 years. Other than that, theoretically, there are no restrictions, no upper age, no lower age below 21. You can be single, any gender, identify in any way. You can be, it doesn't matter. Sometimes, I think in my day when I adopted, which is 10, 11 years ago now, there was, I certainly had conversations with my social worker about, projecting ahead. So if I adopt a 5-year-old child and I'm 50, what's that going to feel like when that child is in their late teens, kind of thing. So that's just common sense, I think, but there's certainly no absolute exclusion according to age.
The other question we've just got here about exclusions is, would one of the adoptive parents being on antidepressants be seen as a problem?
Shouldn't be, no, should absolutely not. And I think, again, social workers are human beings, and it comes down to the connection between the social worker and the prospective adopter. And some social workers would be more nervous about that than others. But actually, the way to think about that is, I was having challenges, I sought help, and the help that I have sought has helped me to deal with those challenges. That is an incredibly positive thing to be able to say, and a brave thing to be able to say. And that's, it's kind of thinking about how you present yourself and sell yourself. It's an awful thing to say, but it's kind of how do I talk about the challenges that I've had in my life in a way that shows I have experienced things and come through the other side of them, or I am dealing with them.
We've got another question that's kind of related to that, about the approach of adoption agency and social workers towards counselling and therapy. And would it be seen as a positive or a negative if someone had been going through it? And I think you've kind of answered that, it would be seen as a positive.
Should be. I can't say that every social worker will have that attitude, but I think most these days would see that as a good thing.
Anya, I wonder, how did you actually find it going through this process? We've spoken quite a lot about it being sort of intrusive and stuff. Did you find it like that?
Not massively. I really liked our social worker. She was great. It was trying to squeeze in the meetings, I guess. I'm married to a teacher, and so him finding time to do anything was tricky. I didn't really find it that intrusive, and honestly, for us, and I know this isn't the same for everyone, but for us, compared to going through fertility treatments, I found the process actually okay. It was lengthy, it was a little bit intrusive, but it was okay. I felt like they were on our side a lot of the time. I liked our social worker. We had a good rapport. I felt she really got us. So it was all doable, to be honest.
We've got another question that I think is probably for you, actually, Anya, by someone who says that they follow someone, a thing on Twitter, a hashtag on Twitter, where there are a lot of adult adoptees who are very negative about adoption and that it's really freaked them out, and is asking, are there any adults who are actually positive about adoption? Well, I think we've got one here for a start. We've got two here, actually.
Yeah, I'm hugely positive about it, but neither am I going to sugarcoat and say this is an easy thing to do, which is why, and Kate will know this very well, anyone that says to me the just adopt craze, yeah, it's really, I find it so problematic. But I think actually that the Twitter hashtag that she's referring to, I think has a place actually, because there's a lot of people that feel that they've been squeezed out of the conversation. A lot of adult adoptees, a lot of birth parents. We've sort of, adoption often goes through trends and swings, and we sort of focus on one bit or we focus on another bit. We're not always great with adoption, I don't think, at doing a holistic and real picture and saying, look, certain aspects are tricky, certain aspects are normal and boring, certain aspects are great. And I think the Twitter hashtag they're referring to is actually part of the process that's been ignored for a long time. And so I don't want to negate it, but if I was a prospective adopter, it wouldn't want to be where I'd want to go, because actually there's an awful lot of people that are very positive about adoption, and you know, really not just adoptive parents but adoptees. So it's never black and white. And I do feel like actually there's a place for it, but it certainly wouldn't be where I'd want to go if I was looking into adoption. I think
I mean, it is a very, very strong, very vocal minority of adopted adults who are extremely aggrieved and who believe that adoption is per se a bad thing. And there's no shying away from that. That is just some people's reality. But it's not a majority. I mean, well, but I'm not in any way dismissing it. It is absolutely legitimate and we need to listen to it. It isn't the majority view. We at Adoption UK work with a lot of adopted adults because we value their views and their experience, and because they want to use their experience to improve the system for people who come after them, and because they've got stories to tell. You know, some of them are going through tracing their birth families in adulthood. For some that's a very positive experience, for some it's deeply negative. So I think it's really good to have. I don't think I knew any of that before I adopted, so it's healthy to know about it, but try not to, you know, for some children adoption is desperately needed intervention for some of the most vulnerable children in the UK, and there is no getting away from that. And the adult adoptees who are critical of adoption don't have a viable alternative solution, because what they want to happen is children to be kept within wider birth families. And for the most vulnerable children, that is not possible, because the wider family are an unsafe place for those children to grow up. So that's the crux of the matter, really.
Thank you. That's really useful to kind of explain that and put it into perspective, I think. Another interesting question from someone saying, as someone with no birth children, they're really sad about the idea of adopting and missing the infant stage. I wonder, Anya, how did you find that, missing that with your adopted child?
So I think I am slightly different in that we had birth children, and I think you have to acknowledge that, because actually there is maybe a loss of part of parenting that you were expecting. So I'm not going to minimize those feelings, and they might need to be unpacked in counseling, in some kind of acknowledgement during that time frame. But you know, those baby days are really, you know, they're so quick anyway. We adopted our son at 15 months, so we've had huge amounts of the toddler experience, and it feels like a massive privilege anyway, no matter what age we were going to adopt him at. I think it does feel like a really big privilege to be part of his story. So, but I don't think you should shy away from those feelings. Those are the kind of things that will come up during the home visits from the social worker, and rightly so. You know, how do you feel about missing certain aspects? And it's all right to acknowledge them. Don't fear that.
Alison, a question for you here, whether there are any medical requirements. Someone's asking about a chronic life-limiting condition of one prospective parent. Would that be a problem?
So you will need to have medical checks as part of there are medical checks as part of the process. And different agencies will see different medical conditions in different ways, I'm afraid. It's difficult to kind of generalize. A life-limiting condition, I think that feels to me like it would be a conversation about the other part of the partnership, and prepare and feeling confident that they, you know, very sadly, when they find themselves in that position, have the resilience and skills to raise the child or children alone, or obviously with another partner. But I don't think that would be an automatic exclusion, but it would obviously be something, you know, if I was that family social worker, I would want to explore very carefully.
Another question about eligibility around what type of background checks are done, and is there a certain target financial savings level that a couple would have to have?
No. Again, no. I mean, your finances should not exclude you. Do not automatically. There's no automatic exclusion, regardless of your finances. The question is, so the bottom line is, I mean, really the thing you need is resilience, for reasons which we can go into more, but you really need to be resilient, and you need to be able to put the child first, and the child will put themselves first in a very, very dramatic way if you don't get that right. So I think it's that resilience and sort of wherewithal. If money means you wouldn't ever be, you know, it depends on the degree, doesn't it? If money meant that you would never be able to afford the basics or an occasional treat, or would struggle with things like buying school uniform maybe, or things like that, but then obviously that needs to be given some serious thought. But those are the thoughts that you'd have before you had a birth child anyway. So in that sense, it's no different. I think it's, you know, social workers aren't going to say you only earn 12 grand a year, you can't adopt. No one's going to say that to you. No.
It's quite an interesting question here, and I don't know if you can answer this one, about do you basically have to be a UK citizen? This is someone who's got pre-settlement status with a EU scheme, and until February 2024 can apply for permanent settlement. Is it asking if they can start the adoption process when they're in that stage of still applying?
I don't know the answer to that question, I'm afraid. But my understanding is that you have to have been a UK citizen for at least 2 years. But it's possible that because, you know, it might be because the adoption process takes a while, an agency might be willing to take. I think it would also depend on whether you were, anyway, I was going to say a single adopter or in a couple, but I don't know. I don't know the answer. You need to make some phone calls and ask.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. No, I thought that was quite a specific question. We've got another one here about social workers. Someone asking if you don't get on with the social worker or struggling with one particular social worker, can you request to change them?
Yes. And in fact, that happened to me. My social worker and I did not see eye to eye. I didn't really realise that at the time, but we got quite a long way down the track, and I realised that she was being extremely judgmental and had concerns about things that she hadn't told me she had concerns about. And I changed social worker, and actually, you know, the problem with it is you might be asked to go back and repeat the whole process with the new social worker. So again, I think it varies agency to agency, but certainly if you feel like your relationship with your social worker is jeopardizing your chances of adoption, you need to tell your agency about it.
Okay, thanks. A specific request, Anya, for you to talk a bit more about moving on from fertility treatment and loss and leaving behind the biological chance to have a child, and which things helped you with that. I mean, obviously, you've explained that your situation was slightly different in that you'd had successful IVF, but what helped you? Because you just wanted another child, didn't you?
Yeah. I mean, and we talked about adoption right the way through. My brothers are adopted. Adoption's always been very positively talked about in my family. It's a good thing. So it's always at the back of our mind. Then we had fertility treatments, and there were issues with both of us. And so the whole concept of genetics and what is family came into our mind very early on as well. So adoption was sort of simmering away and had always felt very positive. I think it, for us, it maybe wasn't as difficult a jump as if that was your route to parenthood and that if we hadn't experienced. But I think the whole exploration of what does it mean to be family, what is family, the fact that families in the UK these days are in so many different shapes and sizes, and it's wonderful that actually we've moved anyway as a society to a much more all-encompassing view of what family can be. So I think adoption fits into that. You know, I certainly don't have any issue thinking of him as, you know, not genetically mine. He's my son because he's the one that tries to interrupt webinars with his Kindle for me to do the pin. That's why I know he's my son. You know, it's not a case of I had to give birth to him. That's not my reality. But I do think there's an acknowledgement that there can be, and it's okay for there to be a sadness about it as well. You know, for many people with adoption, there is some form of a letting go of what you thought family might look like, of some of the stages involved, and that's okay. All of that is okay. I think we fear saying any of this stuff in case a social worker or someone turns around and says, oh, you obviously don't want this enough to adopt. And for me, it's exactly what you've just said, Alison, in that to me, it shows that you've got resilience. If you've been through fertility treatment, you know how to do resilience, but you also know how to engage with the process. You've thought through what family can look like, all of these things, and these are strengths actually when moving from treatment to adoption. Actually, there's quite a lot of strength that you bring with you on that journey that maybe you wouldn't have had otherwise. And you mustn't underestimate that. So, you know, when they talk about the resilience of adoption, boy, have you shown resilience if you've been through one IVF or one IUI. You know how to do resilience, and that will serve you better than anything else as an adoptive parent, because you really need to know resilience then. You really do.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that. I think that's probably really helpful for a lot of people to know that. Another question that I think is probably for you, Anya, is what's the process like after you've adopted the child, and how long are you in touch with the social worker for?
So this is where I like to hope, looking at Adoption UK's amazing barometer, I like to hope that we've moved on a little bit over the last few years. And post-adoption, I think generally feels like it's got better, and there's it seems like there's more awareness. Things like the Adoption Support Fund wasn't there when we first adopted. There seems to be more of an acknowledgement that actually adoption doesn't end with the child being placed in a home. That's when adoption starts. You know, all the bit to lead up to that point is frustrating and long-winded and everything, but adoption is really post-placement. It's about that family building, and you need every bit of support that you can do. I think for me, we didn't quite get the support that we should have done. We were in touch with our social worker, I think, is it 4 years? How many years are you?
3.
3 years that you're under the care of the first adoption local authority, and then you move to your own local authority for care. And just being really honest, the care that we got the first few years was just not there at all. It really wasn't. I wish it had been, and I wish we'd been more mindful about what we needed. I have to say, I live in Hackney now, and actually I think Hackney post-adoption support's pretty good, and I think they're full of people that are trying, and we have moved on a lot. But I think still, again, going back to the adoption barometer, I'd still say the experience of adoptive families that we see across the board is they're really resilient, they're really tenacious, but they're pretty battered and bruised a lot of the time, and pretty worn out. And that's because I think a lot of the stuff is not quite in place. For example, if I had a magic wand, it would just be that there was a pathway of care for every single family the minute you have a child placed with you, or slightly before, that was automatic, so that you as the adoptive parent aren't scrabbling around for support, but that there's something in place that's set up to help you. And we're not quite there yet at all, but there have been good moves as well. I mean, again, Alison would know more because she's seen much more of the overview, but certainly that's my experience, is that the post-adoption support was lacking.
Alison, could you just say a bit about what there is available now in terms of post-adoption support?
Yeah, sure. And also, I think the questioner was interested in how long the social worker sticks around after the placement. So it depends. So when your child comes to live with you, they are not yet adopted. I think that's important to say. So they have what's called a placement order. So you have to then wait at least 10 weeks, basically, just to make sure that, you know, things are sufficiently stable, and then you can apply for a court order, for an adoption order. So then what happens is you go back to court, you go to court, I should say, and the judge will sign an adoption order, and at that point you have full parental responsibility for that child, and they are legally yours in the same way as if they were your birth child. So that's the way it works. And so as we're in England, I'll talk about England. So there's a thing called the Adoption Support Fund, which is a 50 million quid a year pot of money held by the government, which is specifically for therapeutic support for adopted children. And the way that works is that you work with your agency, your adoption agency, to apply for funds for that pot of money, basically. And there's those sort of specialist support services, and then there's stuff that your agency should just offer ordinarily, which is things like bits of additional training, and, you know, a helpline and stuff like that, and perhaps meetups with other adoptive families in your area, that sort of thing. So I think I saw another question pop up, which was about what struggles, you know, what struggles do adopters face with their children. And so it's obviously relevant in this context about support. So I think it's fair to assume that all adopted children are going to need support. And the reason for that is what we've been talking about. They have experienced significant trauma in their early childhoods before they come to live with you. And that has often lifelong impacts. And you'll be taught about that when you go through preparation and training. And that is, you know, it's on a spectrum from incredibly mild to incredibly severe. And before a child is placed with you, you will learn a lot about that child, and you will decide whether that's a child that you feel that you could parent, you know, and is the right fit for your family. So you're not kind of going into it blind, generally speaking, especially given that the average age of adoption is 3.5. You will know a fair amount about that child before they come to live with you. Having said that, you can't know everything. And so you know, the likelihood is you'll need ongoing support. So a lot of adopted children, the majority of adopted children, need extra support in school, for example. So and that's for a range of social and emotional problems that they might have. So they might have problems attaching to adults, you know, they might be wary of adults, they might not trust adults, they might have inherited learning difficulties from their birth family, they might just have very low self-esteem. All of these things affect their you know, the way that they manage school. So that's just one example of the kind of issues. And I think at some stage, most children who come from that kind of trauma background are going to need some specialist therapeutic support in some area of their lives. And obviously then if you're adopting a child with a disability, then that will come with its own support needs as well. In a nutshell, that's the way it works.
Can I just butt in at that point and say, for us, actually the adoption process has been, challenging, but for us, learning how to best support a child with fetal alcohol has been really the most difficult aspect. So when we adopted, we were told literally, I mean, I'd say we were with the doctor for about 15 minutes with him explaining birth mum we knew that she drank, but we, and then there may be some issues coming up, but literally that was it in terms of what we were told. And it's been a real process of learning what his diagnosis is, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, what that means, what his huge amount of strengths are, what he struggles with and needs support with, and where to get that help. And I really, really want to do a massive shout out, not just to Adoption UK, but to the FASD hub in Scotland, who without them, and I'm not massively connected with them, but they've really saved our skin a lot of times by just being a massive support. So FASD is incredibly common with adoption, and it really does need quite specific support. It's one of the disabilities that needs that extra support, and I think for us that's been a huge challenge, but there are strengths with it as well. So lifelong learning, I think.
Someone's asked a question about dealing with birth parents. I mean, what happens with adoption? Are you still dealing with the birth parents in any way afterwards, usually, or not?
You want to answer that, Anya?
So it varies, and again, the heart of it is what's the best interest for the child. So it varies from letterbox contacts, which might be the occasional letters, to direct contact, to contact with other family members. I think letterbox contact is the most common. For us, it hasn't been successful. Unfortunately, we've not had any interaction letterbox wise. We haven't had any letters or communication, and we've found it very difficult to find any information to share with our son about birth family now, and that's been quite hard. But I do know other people that letterbox contacts has been an absolute game changer, really, really useful for their family. And all the research, I think, isn't there an article in this Adoption UK magazine, I think, about contacts? It's one of the recent ones, and about the importance of it. And it's interesting, again, the trends have changed with adoption in terms of what we thought was best, but it really does seem now that where we can keep some kind of continuity and awareness of the birth family, that seems better for the child. But unfortunately it hasn't been successful with us. Maybe it will do one day, I don't know.
I think it's important to say that it's very, very rare to have face-to-face contact with birth parents. Yes. I mean, almost unheard of.
Yeah.
So this will all be written into your court order, your child's court order. So what's very common is sibling contact. So direct contact with siblings who are placed with other families, for example, or are still in foster care. And that, in my experience, has been a really good thing. So my daughter's got 4 brothers and we see them all. And that's, I love that. And she loves it. And some of them love it more than others. But, it's a kind of really interesting mix. But most children's birth parents will not be allowed legally to have any direct contact with their child until they're 18. And that's, as Anya says, the situation is changing quite a lot. And some people want to reach out and make contact sooner than that, and that's up to them. But the norm is not to have direct contact with birth parents.
We've got another quite interesting question from someone asking about the difference between adoption and fostering to adopt, and asking also why young babies go to foster parents first rather than being ready for adoption. I wonder if you could just explain a bit about that, Alison.
So there's an increasing trend towards what's called early permanence, which is where you apply to be both a foster carer and an adopter, and you take the child on a fostering basis first with a primary plan that that child is going to be placed for adoption with you, but you carry the risk, or the meanwhile work continues with the birth family, on the understanding that it is always better, if it's possible and safe for the child to live with their birth family. So there will be ongoing attempts to work with the birth family in the hope that that situation could be sufficiently made stable and safe that the child could be returned to the birth family, but with the understanding that that's quite unlikely, and that the likely plan is that the child will stay with you for adoption. So it's an interesting thing, and you know, a lot of us who didn't have that option when we were adopting think, oh my God, I'm not sure I could cope with that level of uncertainty. But for a lot of people, that is, you're more likely to get a younger child, and you're more likely to go through the process a lot quicker if you go down an early permanence route than a kind of traditional adoption route.
So the reason that babies are put into foster care first is because there's still that kind of attempt to see if, yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah. Someone's asked a question, a very honest question. What do you recommend if I don't feel able to or ready to parent a child who's got extra needs?
I think it depends what you mean by extra needs, and that's a thing that you need to explore for yourself. So if you mean by extra needs a child with significant disabilities, either learning difficulties so that they wouldn't be able to cope in mainstream school, or wheelchair bound, or with a significant medical condition, then that's one thing. If you mean, I'm not sure I could cope with my child displaying difficult behaviour, then you might want to think really carefully about whether adoption is the right route for you. To be perfectly honest and cards on the table, most adopted children do have social emotional problems because of their backgrounds. You are trained and prepared to parent those children in a particular way. It's called therapeutic parenting, and it's in a lot of ways differs to birth parenting. But you're trained and prepared for that, and I think that it's very important for you to get your head around that. And you don't need to do that before you make an inquiry, by the way. You can step into the process, feel your way into it, ask lots of questions, meet adopters, go on our forum, meet other prospective adopters. As I said right at the beginning, you can duck out at any stage. So it might be something that you want to explore as you go along in the process.
There's a question from someone who says that it seems with the adoption process as if they're looking for the perfect family, and is anyone really that? And I think feeling maybe they're not that person, saying that actually they want to have children, they don't always get on with all children. And do you think there is this kind of idea that you have to be absolutely perfect to adopt? But that's not really the case, is it?
Well, Kate, you know us as a family, you know that's not true. Firstly, there's no perfect family. There just isn't. It's not about that. I think sometimes maybe what they're picking up on is this sort of superhuman thing that's put on adoptive families, where they're sort of like, oh, you're so amazing, and isn't it fantastic what you've done, and you know, all of this kind. And you just think, I'm not amazing. I've just opened a home up and jumped, basically. But I do think there's this sort of myth that they love out there about adoption, that it's all these superhuman people. It's really, really not. You do not have to be perfect. Partly because that doesn't exist, but partly because let's not put that on ourselves. You know, the whole therapeutic parenting thing, that's not about being perfect. It's about being real and honest and parenting in a different way, but it's certainly not about perfect parenting. So no, there's a lot of myths we need to unpack about adoptive families and adoption and adoptive parenting, but hand on heart, we are not a perfect family at all, and anyone that knows me will know that 100%, but we're just giving it a go.
And I mean, you have the same challenges about bedtimes and teeth brushing and boyfriends and tech, and honestly, 90% of the time, or not, maybe not 90%, 80% of the time, it's just like normal family life, and then it has some bells and whistles added to it just to push your buttons a bit further. But most of it is you just muddle your way through and figure out what's right for you and your kid. But I would second what Anya said at the start about recommending Sally Donovan's books, because they are wonderful, and they will, if you need convincing that you don't have to be perfect to be an adopter, then read her books. They are all wonderful and funny and truthful. So do have, and she's the parent of 2 now grown up adopted kids who were extremely challenging and can continue to be so. So she speaks from deep personal experience.
We're really running out of time now. I'm sorry to those questions we didn't get round to, but I wondered, both of you, if you had a last tip to give people when thinking about this, what it would be. I think one thing we can say that you've both said is read these books, which are obviously really helpful. But is there anything you'd say to people, a final tip from both of you?
Go on.
I think mine would be get in touch with other prospective adopters and people who've already done it. Because that network is going to stand you in really good stead going forward. I mean, you'll need it for the whole of your life with your child, and there are lots of ways to access that. You don't need to just randomly know someone who's adopted. We have an online forum, it's free. You don't have to be a member of Adoption UK to use it. Fertility Network, I'm sure, have got forums where people are chatting to each other about adoption as well. We've got local community groups in most people's areas. We've got groups for free groups for prospective adopters, and just talk to people would be my advice.
I think absolutely all of that. I would say just start to unpick the myths from the reality with adoption. As with fertility treatment, there's so many myths around what it is and isn't, and there really are with adoption. There's a lot of assumptions about what the child is like, what the parent is like, what the process is like. Just start to unpick that and find out the reality by reading the books, by speaking to people, and then make sure that you have every drop of support around you that you possibly can call on. And please don't be hesitant about that. Build that support structure from early days. Get people on board in the way that's going to be most helpful. That phrase about it takes a village to raise a child has never ever been so true for us as a family having an adopted child. I cannot do this on my own, and I will not do it on my own. So that's why I turn constantly to Adoption UK, Sally Donovan books. I'm not doing this on the Adoption and Fostering podcast is wonderful. There's some just brilliant resources out there, but you do not do this on your own. We're a village, and we'll cheer each other along and hand the tissues out when needed as well.
I think what we need to do is maybe put together a list of those good resources, and if anyone wants them, you can email me. That's kate@fertilitynetworkuk.org, kate@fertilitynetworkuk.org, and we'll give you a list to some of those resources that we've talked about this evening. But thank you so much, Anya, for joining us this evening, and particularly thank you to Alison. You've both been absolutely brilliant. I think we're going to have to come back to this subject again, because there's so much more to say and so many more questions that people wanted to ask. So we will definitely come back to this again, but thank you all so much. Go to the Adoption UK website if you want to find out more. Have a look at our website if you want support. Our support line's open every day of the week, so do please call the support line if you want any help. But thank you all for joining us this evening. It's been really interesting, and I hope you've all found it useful. I've certainly learned masses, and there's lots of thank yous there in the chat box for Alison and Anya. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of the evening.
Thanks very much.